So let me just quickly pray, and we've probably got quite a shortish passage today, but I didn't want to embed it in some more verses because it's actually got, for me, what's quite an important element to it, which helps me understand in a kind of a play with ideas sort of way some of the issues of the Trinity and how a good person can actually be sinful. You'll think, how do I get that? Well, I'll talk it through when we get there. So it's got a potentially kind of I think a reasonably deep conversation embedded in a short text. So I'll just pray, Father. Just pray you'll bless us and challenge us in our thinking this afternoon as we look at your prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, in Jesus' name. Amen. So yeah, I'm calling it. I think in the email we sent out, it said 36 to 46. I've gone to 47 because a lot of these verses, as we're chopping them, there are verses that are half in and half out. You know, they become the transition verses. So we'll look up to verse 47 today. But the focus of everything we're looking at is Jesus's prayer in Gethsemane. And Gethsemane, of course, means oil press, which has a kind of theological symbolic meaning to it, because we see the pressure that Jesus comes under. But equally, it also plays an interesting kind of scene setting, as we'll think about as we go through, as we try and imagine the story happening and playing out. So we actually finished on verse 36 last time. So we finished, and you can see how this kind of sits half and half. Then Jesus came to the place called Gethsemane. That's how we finished last time. But then transitioning on to what's going to happen next. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go further and pray. We often, there are a couple of sites which are identified as Gethsemane. I'm looking forward because I'm out in Israel in 2 weeks, and one of the things we're planning to do is to walk from the Last Supper location to one of the potential sites for Gethsemane. Whichever it is, they're very close, because obviously towards the Mount of Olives. The name tells us that it's a working oil press. There's probably therefore an orchard of olive trees around it, and then there are some buildings in the middle, and the buildings are interesting. It probably means as well that there's a bit of a wall. There will be animals potentially kept at certain times of the year out near the press, because obviously in the morning you hook the press to a donkey and get it walking around and round the circle to crush the olives as they come. So there are buildings for those things. There are buildings to store the jars in which oil will be kind of decanted, I suppose it's the right word, will be put into. And so as we kind of imagine them coming, I couldn't tell you at this stage, and probably won't be able to tell you after we've been, how the kind of, if you like, the concentric circles of there being the centre area where there's working buildings and the physical press and place for the animals to stay. So that becomes a sort of centre. How is that walled or hedged around? There would be some sort of demarcation, probably also for the actual olive grove itself. But it wouldn't be difficult to kind of jump a wall. It's not that it's totally high fences or anything. But there's that kind of sense of there being two areas, probably. I say probably, can't be 100% certain. But a bit of a kind of a demarcation of these olive trees belong to this press. It's of course very possible that people bring them from further afield. And then this press happens within a little complex of buildings, of which there's probably another separation and a gate too. So as we get there, it says that Jesus took Peter and the sons of Zebedee with him and began to be sorrowful. So that implies that it's just Peter and James and John who come to the central section. As we read in other Gospels, it talks about the disciples coming there, and they're all there towards the end. But you can kind of see as we're getting there, okay, we're going to pray here in the olive grove. Groves of trees are common places, or under trees as places of prayer. You remember when right at the beginning of the Gospels, say of the Gospels because it's not in Matthew, in John's Gospel, when Jesus sees Philip, says, "I saw you sitting under the olive tree," and is it under the vine? But he's kind of quoting that, he's making an allusion to the Old Testament where it talks about under every man under his own vine, under his own olive tree. That the idea of sitting there and praying, it's probably a place of prayer. So they come to that region. It's a good place to pray. It kind of fits with all of the old patriarchs that would sit by trees and pray. We read that of Abraham and others and so on. But there's a kind of a central bit, and as we progress towards that, we hear that the people that come closest are Peter, James, and John. Although Matthew doesn't refer to them directly as James and John, he calls them the sons of Zebedee. And it's interesting that I just looked it up before we started because it suddenly struck me. Matthew regularly refers to James and John not by name but by reference to their dad, to Zebedee, which should mark out to us something of significance. Matthew, in the sense of the very first time we meet them, it talks about James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. So James being the older, who of course is is martyred early. But then, so James is there and his brother John, and they are the sons of Zebedee. So Zebedee actually appears far more often than the phrase James and John in Matthew's Gospel. In fact, the phrase James and John only appears once in Matthew's Gospel, which is when he goes up the Mount of Transfiguration, which tells me that Zebedee is someone of significance in the early days of the church. And that shouldn't surprise us because we also pick up that the mother of James and John is there at the cross. And by comparing the Gospels, it looks like her name is Salome. She is the one who comes to Jesus and asks for James and John to sit on his left and the right. And Salome, therefore, becomes an apostle of the resurrection. She is commissioned by Jesus to go and carry the message. So she's an important person, and therefore her husband is also an important person. Matthew avoids naming her, but he does name Zebedee. So it just kind of, there's also the possibility, which, as you put those things together, that Zebedee is actually a brother of Joseph. I say it's a possibility. We kind of, we know that Clopas is. Zebedee might be dead by now. Sorry, not by now in the Gospel. Sorry, at the time Luke was writing, and he refers to Clopas. But the fact that Salome is potentially referred to as being Mary's sister, which could also mean sister-in-law, the in-law would make sense. It would mean that John the son of Zebedee is a cousin of Jesus, which would perhaps also make him distantly related to John the Baptist. So he could have even been named after John the Baptist because of the naming conventions of the day. So we can't ever be certain, but you look at the early church records and the references they make there, understanding Zebedee, Clopas, and Joseph as being brothers. Joseph has died by now. We're not sure about the other two, but Zebedee may have lasted longer because he's clearly known to the church at this stage. So anyway, that was a very unhelpful kind of little waffle, just on the fact that Zebedee comes in rather than naming James and John. He seems to be a significant character as probably the son of, as the husband of Salome and a father of two apostles. So anyway, so Jesus takes those people. They go into the more central area where the buildings probably are, to kind of to find a more secluded part, more separated part to pray. And Jesus said, began to be sorrowful and full of heaviness. There's a flow of a run of words here, which kind of grief, heaviness, sorrow. And then he said to them, my soul is encircled by grief. The actual word in Greek, which is why you notice I've hyphenated it, encircled by grief, is perilupos. So lupos is grief, and peri, as in a perimeter which goes around. It means that it's all, that whatever the word that comes next is, all around it. That word is all around whatever the is it the verb? No, the adverb is being applied to. So the grief is surrounding him. It's totally encircling him. So my soul is encircled by grief, even to death. And I kind of went for that slightly unusual way of translating. You'll often see it just says is very grieved or very sorrowful, something like that. But I thought I'd capture the idea of it being all around because of the fact that there is a sort of symbolic sense in which Jesus going through the pressure of the crucifixion, even before the crucifixion happens, the pressure of what he is about to enter into. And so that idea of surrounding pressure I kind of like to draw out. So my soul is encircled by grief, even to death. It's a kind of a crushing grief. I'm looking at what's coming. We don't read it here. We read it in Luke's gospel that as he's sweating, that there's blood in the sweat. Which is as a phenomenon we've seen actually in people who are sentenced to execution, where the pressure of them anticipating what is coming means that their brow is so furrowed that it actually breaks blood vessels as just by the sweat glands, and you get blood and sweat coming out. So we know that from Luke's gospel, but here it's just Jesus is talking about this surrounding sense of grief and sorrow. And so in that context, which is a very heavy one, he says, wait here and watch alongside me. The word there for with is not the more kind of common word for with, although it's used right the way through this passage and often just translated as with, which is why I've given it the slightly longer alongside. It's actually the word meta, as in when we talk about the metanoia, which is repentance, or metatarsal, which is a tarsal which is alongside your other tarsal or with your other tarsal. And it's very much a kind of inconsequence type of with. It's not just here are two things and they just happen to be there. It's one is in consequence to the other. So Jesus is actually asking them to watch, not just physically alongside, but in consequence to the fact that he is watching, which is a kind of a euphemism for a style of prayer. He's going to be praying seriously, and he is asking them to wait here and to pray alongside, not just physically, but actually to really as a consequence of the prayer he is going through. So Matthew is actually kind of painting a picture where there's a really kind of an important moment happening. It comes in a place which is an oil press. And the symbolism of both pressure and of oil, and the good things that come out of it are there. There's a sense of that those people moving in closer. They're closer with Jesus than the rest of the disciples, all of whom are there within the vicinity of the wider garden, the grove. But probably more near the centre, Peter, James and John have the privilege of going alongside. And the question to them, or the statement to them, is to be there in spirit with Jesus, not just there physically, which then creates the contrast with obviously what comes next. So going a bit further, he fell on his face. So it's quite a dramatic. The actual word is kind of a light on his face, as to a light on something, So we'll often say to fall. But the emphasis in the Greek is on the landing. It's kind of, so he fell on his face, he landed on his face, you can think of it those ways, and prayed. So there is a sense in which, although we can't be certain, but the emphasis is almost the weight of the things means Jesus has to go down. It's not just a kind of a humble prostrating. It's the sense of falling flat there. And feeling that sense of pressure. And so he says, my Father, which is an incredibly intimate title. Jesus is the first person to refer to God as my Father, and teaches us to, well, when we pray, we often say our Father because we're doing it corporately, but the more intimate sense of not just Father, but my Father. So the word Father has been used in the Old Testament before for God, but Jesus has adopted it as my Father. And if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. So there's a kind of an interesting parallelism with what we've read in Matthew just before, where Jesus has taken a single cup, or his own cup, at the Passover meal and actually passed it around to the disciples. But here there is a cup that actually only he potentially is going to drink from. And then here's this little phrase, yet not as I will, but as you will. And the word, the second will isn't actually there in the Greek, but we put it in for completeness sake. So it's not as I will, but as you would, what you want, not what I want. And this is where I said there's a really, this whole passage, which I'm going to quickly jump forward to a verse which we're going to look at next week because it's outside of here. But it kind of ties in and emphasizes that as Jesus is in this place of prayer, there is a difference in what he wants and what his Father wants. And that's a really interesting tension or dynamic when it comes to our understanding of the interactions and place of the Trinity. And how and that actually gives us then an insight in how it is that God can make someone who's fully good, who yet is also capable of sin. Because what it shows you here in this place of pressure is that Jesus is capable of sin because he has a different desire to his Father. How can the same Spirit, the Spirit of God that indwells Jesus, that proceeds from the Father, that unifies them together, how can the same person, if we think of the completeness of the Godhead, have different desires? See, this is more emphasized, I think, in the verse I was going to refer to, which is when Peter is going to strike at one of the people who comes to arrest Jesus, and Jesus says, "Put your sword away." And he said, "Don't you realize that if I had asked," so in this context of prayer that we're coming to look at now, if in this context of prayer I had asked, the Father would have sent 12 legions of angels to save me. So there's a really interesting mix of things going on here, which I think is just what, as I say, it's a short passage, but there's a potentially quite deep thing to discuss. And I want to kind of play it out, not because I have conclusions on it, but there are interesting things as we meditate to try and understand what's going on. So here is Jesus saying, is there any way that it could come away from me? And in one sense, the answer is yes, because Jesus says, if I had prayed, then God would have done this. But in another sense, there isn't, because he's saying, but not as what I would want, but what you want to the Father. So as I'm here, I recognize that your perspective is more important than my perspective. And yet we are, of course, of the same Spirit. How do we see things differently at this moment in time? Which is one question. Secondly, if Jesus did ask, it's not because, if you like, the Father is therefore ultimately so more important that the Father would say, sorry you asked some, but it's inevitable, you're going to go through it anyway. In other words, it's really important that Jesus turns around what he wants and subsumes it under the will of the Father, to actually, as he goes into the cross, it is a totally by his own free choice, voluntarily given. And if he couldn't possibly voluntarily give it, it would be legitimate for the Father to remove the cup from him and send 12 legions of angels. But the Father is not going to do that except that the Son asks it. Hopefully you're getting all of the tensions going on. And it tells you something to meditate on in the nature of the Godhead and the personalities, but equally it highlights how even in a single individual, what we actually want very often is shaped by our context, and therefore our context, which can see to a certain degree. And we have already heard from Jesus that there are things that the Father knows that the Son doesn't know. And is that because that's intrinsic to their nature? I suspect not. Is it intrinsic to their context? I think so. By what I mean is that Jesus has taken on humanity, which is limited in its perspective to some degree of freedom within its moment in space and time. So I stand here I don't stand, I'm sitting at the moment. Sitting here, I can see a few feet to one side, a few feet to the left, to the right. I can see a little bit ahead of me. I can turn around and look behind me. I can imagine things that might happen tomorrow. I can imagine things that might happen in 5 years' time. I can't imagine things with any great kind of clarity that are happening in 20 or 30 years' time, let alone 100 or 1,000 years' time. I have a limitation on my spirit given to me by my context and my physicality. And that is true of the Son of God as he takes on our flesh and becomes human. So in his humanity, the spirit is perfect, but it is limited in perspective, and therefore will come to different conclusions to the same spirit if it was in its unrestricted sense and can see the end from the beginning and knows all things. And the perspective of God from heaven, the Father from heaven, is actually therefore bigger. And so there is a requirement for it's totally possible for a perfectly made creation, a perfectly incarnate spirit, the Spirit of the Son, in its limited context of its humanity, to look at things and desire things that are different to the desires of the Father. And in that context, the challenge is to subject and subsume what we desire to the will of the Father. Not because God's a control freak who can't cope with people having a different perspective, but because he has given us a wonderful life that has exploration involved in it. But exploration requires me not to see and know everything possible like God can, but to see like God, but from a limited perspective, which gives me both the possibility to choose things that God doesn't want, which ultimately, therefore, is what we put the label sin on. That I bring my perspective and say it's better and higher than God's. Even though I can't understand God's, I can understand the concept he can see everything, but I still choose to do mine. And that becomes the place of sin. So I hope that I'm making some sense as I try and tease these things out. But this is why I thought, well, let's not do too many verses today, because I wanted to kind of draw out this tension that we find in the prayer, and that Matthew then articulates, that Jesus kind of reaffirms that I could have chosen something different. If I'd wanted to, I could have chosen something different. I have been deliberately in a place where I am absorbing my sense of my will. Because of its limitations, I recognize the Father's is more important in this context. And so it's not my will, but yours. But it's not a fait accompli. There's a real choice, real perspective, and kind of a deep truth going on here. And so in all of that context where they've heard the beginning, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. They've heard that. They've heard the struggle, and yet on returning to the disciples, he found them to be sleeping and asked Peter, weren't you able to keep watch along with me for 1 hour? So watch and pray so that you don't go through proving. We often have a phrase like don't fall into temptation or don't go into temptation. The don't go through, that's totally legitimate. And the word temptation, the problem is the word temptation in our minds doesn't necessarily mean what it originally meant. So in our minds, it's kind of I'm being enticed by something that I know is sinful from the beginning, which technically is kind of what's going on here. If Jesus he wanted something, Jesus wanted something that that actually would put him in conflict with the Father's will, the Father's desire. And then people put their hands on their head and they say things, oh no, but that contradicts another verse in the Bible where it says it's impossible to tempt God. But there God is the sum of all things, the sum of Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Here it's the Son in his humanity, seeing a perspective, even though he's perfectly good in his heart, seeing things slightly differently, and then having to choose to submit it. So in this sense, Jesus really is going through genuine temptation, is what I'm driving at. But the temptation isn't just some sort of, all kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink type thing. And if you look at the kind of the Greek, it's much more of a testing. It's like a saying or proving. You're proving something to see whether it's genuine, whether the article is genuine. So Jesus' words is, you watch and pray so that you don't have to go through that kind of proving, the testing that you're really genuine. Because the truth is the spirit is willing while the flesh is weak. And yet here is Jesus in his humanity, in his flesh, going through this, even in the weakness of his flesh, making the right choice. And so if we want to think theologically about what is accomplished in the cross, I think what we're hearing here is a really key moment. Even in the weakness of flesh, in the limits of flesh, of a perfectly good spirit dropped into perfectly good flesh, but by its nature doesn't give it the full picture, can't show it everything that is possible, and can't absorb all of those things. It is possible for that flesh to be tempted, and actually there is genuine struggle. Because my whole sense of who I am and everything else is a real, to the degree, as we read it in Luke's Gospel, that the pressure actually creates blood in the sweat for Jesus. And so, he's requested that Peter, James and John are praying alongside him, not just physically, because the other disciples aren't that far away, but they came in close to be in him in it. And Jesus is saying, you're falling asleep here. Pray you don't have to go through this too. And of course, we know that there's a testing coming for Peter, because we know the story. We know the end of the story. So he left again a second time and he prayed, saying, my Father, if this cup can't pass by me unless I drink from it, then your will be done. So if we can't cross this line, if we can't do it other than me doing it this way, then I'm totally submitting. The choice is made. And returning again, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy, or as their eyes were heavy. And having left them again and gone away, so this time the implication is he leaves them sleeping. He returns, he finds them again, doesn't say anything to them, but he leaves them again. And he prayed for a third time, saying the same things. So we're not sure whose testimony it is, who's close enough to hear, or whether they're kind of in their drowsy state, they're aware he's still praying, they're aware that he's visited them while they're praying, they're sleeping. And then he returned to his disciples and said to them, sleep and take your rest later. We see this translated different ways in different translations, but I think the word later is potentially there. But sometimes it's kind of, we hear people saying, don't sleep now. I think the thing, it effectively it means that. If you want to sleep and rest, you're going to have to do it later, because seeing as how the hour is at hand and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. In other words, you slept for a bit, you can sleep at another time, but right now there's something happening and you're going to need to be awake for that. So get up, let's go, look, my betrayer is nearly here. So Jesus recognizes there is going to be a threat to his disciples. That threat is, of course, going to mean that they all run. The threat is because it's not just a small group that's come to arrest Jesus, it's a massive group. And they will try and grab others at the same time, although they know that there's the person they really must get, which is Jesus. So let's go. Look, my betrayer is nearly here, and then we read, setting us up for next week. Just checking the time. I've done pretty well. I thought it was only a few verses. And while he was still speaking, look here, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him a big crowd, along with swords and clubs from the chief priests and elders of the people. And so, as I said, we'll leave the arrest stories and then the pre-trial that happens during the night. We'll leave that until next week. But to kind of sum up, I think that there's a very intimate moment we have this little window into in the prayer session in Gethsemane, where we almost see, if you like, the business of salvation being worked out. as Jesus, in all of his perfection and all of his guidance with the Father, is discovering the desires of good flesh with a good spirit, but by the nature of the fact that they are a different perspective to an eternal God in a spiritual realm, are always going to be, every single person is going to be led to a place where our desires and everything about us, not just trivial desires like, oh, should I eat that cake or not? I feel like it, but I don't want it because I don't want to get too fat or whatever. That's a trivial desire. But the most fundamental ones, the sense of who I am, my sense of existence and in the universe, seems to be conflicted with something in the desire and plans of God. And Jesus wins part of the win of the victory, which will be expressed as he goes through the next the next hours. I'll call them hours, although we'll see they take over a day to work through. As Jesus goes through that by forgiving people around him, by caring for the people around him, even though he's the one who's suffering, all of these little victories. And here is this great big one, where Jesus is fundamentally setting his course at this moment. And so, as I say, that's just a handful of verses, 10 verses, but I wanted to kind of give a bit of time, and I want to give space if anyone wants to ask any questions as well, or make any observations.